The entire case may turn on one 41-minute window between 1:47 a.m., when Nancy Guthrie's camera was disabled, and 2:28 a.m., when her pacemaker stopped transmitting. What happened inside that gap may explain not only how she was taken, but why the case has felt so confusing from the start. The public has been given pieces of the case, but the pieces do not sit neatly together. Investigators say Nancy was likely taken against her will. The camera was deliberately neutralized. Motion was detected later, and the pacemaker went silent at 2:28 a.m. Yet the question of what actually filled those 41 minutes has never been publicly answered in a clear way. An ordinary Saturday night becomes a narrow, terrifying timeline. That timeline raises more questions than answers. Then one possible explanation begins to emerge, and it changes the way the entire case feels. What happened between 1:47 and 2:28? Why would someone disable the camera first? Was Nancy confronted immediately, or was there a delay? And if this was planned, who knew enough to make it possible? At 1:47 in the morning, the camera at Nancy Guthrie's front door went dark. That detail has been repeated so many times that it almost risks sounding familiar. But when you stop and really sit with it, it is one of the most disturbing details in the entire case. An 84-year-old woman is home alone in the Catalina foothills outside Tucson. It is the middle of the night. Her daughter and son-in-law have already driven her home from dinner hours earlier. Her neighborhood is quiet. And then, according to investigators, someone approaches that front door and deliberately disables the camera before anything else happens. That is not random behavior. That is not somebody wandering onto the property by accident. That is a person who came there knowing exactly what they did not want recorded. And then, 41 minutes later, at 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker stops transmitting. Everything lives inside that gap. Because if you can explain those 41 minutes, you may be able to explain the whole case. You may be able to explain whether this was a rushed act or a planned one, whether one person did this or more than one, whether Nancy was confronted immediately or whether something happened first that nobody has publicly pieced together in a clear way. And the strangest part is that for all the coverage this case has received, for all the headlines, all the theories, all the attention, because Nancy is Savannah Guthrie's mother, that 41-minute window has never really been walked through in a way that makes it feel real. Not minute by minute, not in a way that asks the obvious question: what actually happened in that house? Nancy Guthrie, according to reporting and investigators, spent the evening of January 31st, 2026, at her daughter Annie's home in Tucson. She was 84 years old. She had mobility limitations. Sheriff Chris Nanos later said publicly that she could not walk 50 yards by herself. She also had a pacemaker and required daily medication, both of which matter enormously when you think about what kind of victim this was and how vulnerable she would have been if someone targeted her. According to reports, she was driven home that night by her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, and by 9:50 p.m., the garage door had closed behind her. She was home for the night. That part of the timeline is not vague. It is one of the last stable points in the case. For the next several hours, at least publicly, nothing dramatic is recorded. That matters more than people realize. Because when something terrible happens after a quiet stretch, Investigators usually start asking whether the person responsible was waiting for a specific moment. Not just a night, not just a house, a moment. Nancy was not out late at a restaurant. She was not moving around the city unpredictably. She was home. She was likely settling into the familiar routine of the end of the evening. The hearing aids off, the phone charging, the body slowing down, the house becoming still. Then 1:47 a.m. According to investigators, the masked figure seen in the recovered doorbell footage disables the camera in a very deliberate way. FBI Director Kash Patel said the person first used light taps, then used foliage from a potted plant on the porch to cover the lens. That tiny detail is easy to miss, but it tells you something. This person did not walk up in a blind panic. This person adjusted. The first method did not fully solve the problem, so they tried another, calmly. That suggests planning, but it also suggests something else. It suggests they knew the camera was there before they walked up to it. And that raises the first unanswered question. How did they know? Did they scout the house earlier? Did they watch Nancy's routine for days? Did they already know the property well enough to expect that camera at that exact location? Because if the answer is yes, then the case stops looking like a spontaneous intrusion and starts looking like a targeted operation. But that is only the first question. The second is what happened after the camera went dark. Because the public timeline does not say the pacemaker stopped at 1:48. It does not say neighbors heard screaming at 1:49. It does not say a car was seen racing away at 1:50. There is a gap. And inside that gap, investigators say another motion event was detected around 2:12 a.m. That leaves roughly 25 minutes between the disabling of the camera and the next known activity. 25 minutes is a very long time in a case like this. It is long enough for someone to move through the property, long enough to enter the house, long enough to confront Nancy, long enough to look for something, wait for something, or prepare for the next step. That is where this case becomes deeply unsettling, because there are only a few possibilities. One possibility is that the person disabled the camera and entered immediately, and those 25 minutes were spent inside the home with Nancy. Another possibility is even stranger, that the camera was not disabled as the first step, but as one of the last visible steps before leaving, meaning the intruder may have already been on the property or already inside before 1:47. And then there is a third possibility, one that investigators may have considered, even if they have not said so publicly, that the person waited, that they disabled the camera and then remained outside or nearby, either waiting for the right moment, waiting for a signal, or waiting for someone else. If that sounds extreme, think about the timing. At 2:12, emotion is detected again. At 2:28, the pacemaker stops syncing. That gives you a final 16-minute stretch in which something escalates, something changes, something reaches the point where Nancy's medical device is no longer doing what it had done routinely before. And modern pacemakers are not just passive little devices. They monitor heart rhythm continuously. Cardiologists who commented publicly on this case noted that if Nancy experienced fear or physical stress around that time, the device may have recorded changes consistent with that before the final mistransmission. Investigators almost certainly have far more pacemaker data than the public does. They have just never told us what it showed. And that silence may be one of the biggest clues of all. Because if Nancy's final medical data showed a sudden stress response, that would support the idea of a confrontation inside those 41 minutes. If it showed something quieter, something less chaotic, then the picture becomes more complicated. Was she conscious? Was she sedated? Was she moved without the kind of struggle people assume must have happened? That is the part nobody saw coming. The 41-minute gap may not be mysterious because nothing can explain it. It may be mysterious because the explanation is more controlled than people expected. Because when you really look at this timeline, it does not feel messy. It feels measured. Disable the camera. A long gap. Another motion event. Then silence from the pacemaker. That is not how random chaos usually looks. That is how a sequence looks. And once you start seeing it as a sequence, one more question becomes impossible to ignore. If this was planned that tightly, who knew enough to plan it? Who knew Nancy Guthrie would be home that night? That question sounds simple, but it cuts right to the center of the case. Because once you stop looking at the 41-minute gap as a random stretch of missing information and start looking at it as a sequence, the next thing you naturally ask is who could have known enough to make that sequence possible in the first place? Nancy was not a public figure in her own right. She was known because she was Savannah Guthrie's mother, but that is very different from living a public life with a public routine. According to reports, she lived in the Catalina foothills near Tucson, in a quiet, affluent neighborhood where homes sit apart and where nighttime silence can hide a lot. She was 84. She had mobility limitations. She had a pacemaker. She needed daily medication. And on the evening of January 31st, 2026, she was reportedly at her daughter Annie's house for dinner before being driven home later that night. By about 9:50 p.m., she was back inside her own house. That means whoever came to that front door in the middle of the night was not just targeting a house. They were targeting a known routine, a known person, and a known vulnerability. That is what makes the timing so hard to ignore. Because if you are the person planning this, you need more than an address. You need to know Nancy is home. You need to know she is likely alone. You need to know the property well enough to move with purpose. And if the detail in the ransom communication about what Nancy was wearing that night is accurate, then someone either saw her that evening or had access to information only someone close to the evening's events would know. That does not automatically point to one person. It does not automatically point to family. But it does tell you the operation required knowledge, and knowledge has to come from somewhere. This is where the case starts to split in two directions. In one direction, you have the surveillance theory. The idea that somebody spent days, maybe longer, watching Nancy's routine, learning the property, learning when she came and went, learning that she lived alone, learning where the camera was mounted, and maybe even learning which nights she was more likely to be dropped off late and left by herself. That is possible, but the more you think about it, the harder it becomes to believe that surveillance alone explains everything. Because surveillance can tell you where somebody lives. It can tell you what car pulls into the driveway. It can tell you when lights go on and off. What it cannot always tell you is what is happening inside a family's schedule on one particular Saturday night, unless someone has been watching very closely for a very long time, or unless some part of that knowledge was easier to get than it should have been. And that is the uncomfortable direction the case moves in. Investigators have to ask whether this person learned Nancy's routine from outside observation or whether there was some form of inside knowledge somewhere along the chain. Not necessarily direct participation, not necessarily a conspiracy in the dramatic way people imagine, but information. A conversation overheard, a routine noticed, a schedule understood by the wrong person. In cases involving elderly victims from known families, law enforcement always has to ask that question. Not because they are accusing everyone close to the victim, but because crimes like this do not happen in a vacuum. Operational knowledge is one of the most important forms of evidence in a case like this. Even when it is not physical evidence you can hold in your hand. And there is another reason the 41-minute gap matters so much. It does not just suggest planning. It suggests that the person who came there may have known exactly what kind of victim Nancy was. An 84-year-old woman with major mobility limits is not the same as confronting a healthy person in their 40s or 50s. If someone intended to take Nancy from that house, meant they had to know they were dealing with someone who would likely not be able to run, not be able to physically resist for long, and not be able to move quickly without help. That is not just cruel, it is strategic. The house itself makes the picture even stranger. Public descriptions of the scene created confusion almost from the start. Some reports suggested the interior did not show obvious signs of a wild struggle. Other descriptions made it sound more disturbed. Those two versions do not sit comfortably together, and they matter because they change how you imagine those 41 minutes. If the inside of the home was not heavily damaged, then whatever happened may have unfolded much more quietly than people would expect. That could mean Nancy was surprised quickly. It could mean she was physically controlled before she could react. Or it could mean there was less chaos inside the home than the public narrative has assumed all along. That possibility should make everybody uneasy, because it points to a frightening level of efficiency. And yet, at the same time, this was not a perfect crime. The person disabled the camera, yes, but they did not stop the cloud-connected system from pushing footage before the image went dark. That is why the FBI had something to recover at all. That means the person who came there knew enough to neutralize the visible camera, but not enough to fully shut down the digital trail behind it. That combination is telling. It suggests someone who is neither a complete amateur nor a true expert. Someone in the middle. Someone who knew enough to prepare, but not enough to close every door. And that brings us to the question of whether one person really did all of this alone. The figure in the footage is one person. That much is clear. But one visible figure does not automatically mean one actor in the whole operation. If Nancy was taken from the property, moved into a vehicle, and transported somewhere else, then investigators would naturally ask whether a second person was nearby, whether a driver was waiting, whether someone else played a role after the initial approach to the house. The timeline leaves room for that possibility. In fact, the long quiet stretch inside the 41-minute window may make that possibility harder to dismiss, not easier. And then there is the border question. Early in the investigation, law enforcement activity moved south toward Rio Rico, not far from the U.S.-Mexico border. No public explanation ever fully tied that location to a solved lead. But investigators do not move resources that way for no reason. If someone wanted to move a captive elderly woman out of Tucson and toward the border corridor before daylight, the geography allows for it. That does not prove Nancy crossed into Mexico. But it does remind you that the operational possibilities in this case are much larger than one neighborhood and one camera. So now look again at the 41 minutes. A camera is deliberately disabled at 1:47. Motion is detected later at 2:12. The pacemaker stops syncing at 2:28. That is not just a mysterious gap anymore. It is a narrow corridor of action. It suggests whoever did this came with a working idea of what they needed to do and how long it would take. And once you accept that, the case becomes less about a strange night and more about preparation. Somebody prepared for Nancy. Somebody knew enough to come when she was vulnerable, neutralize the camera quickly, and move through that night with just enough confidence to leave behind a timeline that feels more deliberate the longer you stare at it. The question gets even sharper, because if those 41 minutes were structured, then the ransom notes may not have been the beginning of the plan at all. They may have been the point where the plan started going wrong. The ransom notes changed how people saw this case, but they may also have distracted everyone from the most important truth about it. Because by the time those messages started surfacing, the 41-minute gap had already happened. Whatever was going to happen to Nancy Guthrie had already been set in motion between 1:47 and 2:28 in the morning. The camera had already gone dark. The motion had already been detected. The pacemaker had already stopped syncing. In other words, the real event was over before the public ever heard the first demand. And that matters because it forces you to separate two very different questions. The first question is what happened to Nancy inside those 41 minutes. The second is what happened afterward, when the people behind this had to decide what came next. That is where the case may finally start to make emotional sense, even if it still does not feel resolved. Early on, ransom communications began reaching media outlets, including TMZ and a local television station. And some of those messages were treated as potentially real by people close to the case, while others appeared suspicious or outright false. Savannah Guthrie herself later said she tended to believe two of the notes were real. That is a powerful statement, and not one she would likely make lightly. But even if some of those notes were genuine, they do not erase the timeline. They sit after it. They come later. They are not the crime itself. They are the reaction to it. And once you see them that way, the logic shifts. Because if this began as a kidnapping for money, then whoever planned it needed Nancy alive long enough for the demand to matter. That is how ransom works. You do not get paid for a victim you cannot prove is alive. You do not maintain leverage through silence forever. You need communication, proof of life, pressure, and timing. But this case did not develop that way. It became stranger, more chaotic, more confused. The communications created fear, yes, but they did not produce a visible path to resolution. The money was never publicly shown to have changed hands. The case did not move toward a clean negotiation. It drifted into uncertainty. That is why so many people who have looked closely at this case keep circling back to the same dark possibility. What if the original plan failed inside those 41 minutes? What if whoever came to Nancy's house intended one thing and got something else? Nancy was 84 years old. She had major mobility issues. She relied on daily medication. She had a pacemaker. If someone confronted her in the middle of the night, physically moved her, terrified her, restrained her, or otherwise put her body under severe stress, the margin for error would have been very small. That is not speculation in some dramatic sense. That is simply the reality of an elderly victim with serious medical vulnerability. And if something went wrong early, if Nancy went into medical distress, if she became non-responsive, if the people involved suddenly realized they were no longer dealing with a simple ransom scenario, but something much worse, then every move after that would change. Suddenly, the goal is not collection. It is damage control, silence, delay, confusion, anything to avoid the consequences of a crime that has become more severe than expected. That theory does not answer every question, but it explains more than people admit. It explains why the 41-minute gap feels so loaded. It explains why the operation could have begun with control and ended with panic. It explains why the timeline inside the house might look measured, while the public narrative outside the house later became messy. And it explains why the ransom communications, real or partly real, may have felt like echoes of a plan that no longer worked the way it was supposed to. Because when a crime goes wrong, the people behind it often get less coherent, not more. They make partial moves. They test reactions. They delay. They send messages that create noise without solving the central problem. And in this case, the central problem was always Nancy herself. Her age, her condition, her fragility. The fact that this was never a victim who could simply be hidden indefinitely without severe medical consequences. That is one of the harshest truths in the whole case, and it is why the 41-minute gap remains the most important piece of the story. It is the last place where the case still feels physically immediate, the last place where the evidence is rooted in timestamps rather than interpretation. 1:47, camera disabled, 2:12, motion detected, 2:28, pacemaker silent. Everything afterward may reflect confusion, improvisation, false starts, pressure, or deception. But that window is different. That window is the one part that still feels anchored to the body, the house, the night, and the act itself. That is why it matters so much. It strips away some of the noise and leaves you with the shape of what this likely was. Not random, not impulsive, not a mystery because there are no clues. A mystery because the clues point toward structure, and structure points toward planning. And planning points toward knowledge. Somebody knew Nancy would be there. Somebody knew enough about that house to go straight to the camera. Somebody either watched her closely enough to understand her routine or got that understanding from somewhere closer in. Somebody knew this victim was vulnerable, and somebody made a decision to act on that knowledge in the middle of the night, in a quiet neighborhood, in a house where an 84-year-old woman should have been safest. That is the part nobody saw coming. Not just that there was a 41-minute gap, but that the gap itself may already contain the explanation. Not because it tells us every detail minute by minute, but because it tells us the nature of the event, the pacing, the order, the restraint. The fact that this does not look like wild chaos. It looks like a sequence. And once you accept that, the case changes. It stops being a story where the answer must be hidden somewhere far away in abstract speculation. It becomes a story where the answer likely began very close to Nancy, very close to her routine, very close to that house, and very close to the people or information streams that made her predictable to the wrong person. That does not mean the public should rush to accuse whoever feels convenient. In a case this painful and this visible, that kind of certainty can do real damage. Investigators still have to prove what they prove. Evidence still matters. Names still matter. And public theory is not the same thing as fact. But emotional honesty matters too. And emotionally, the 41-minute gap does not feel like empty space anymore. It feels like the moment the whole case turned. The moment a plan was carried out. Or the moment a plan began to collapse. Or both. That is why this case has stayed under people's skin. Because what happened to Nancy Guthrie does not feel like one of those tragedies where the shape of the event is obvious even before the arrest comes. It feels unfinished in a different way. You can sense the outline, but the final pieces are missing, and those missing pieces are not somewhere vague in the distance. They are right there in that narrow strip of time between the camera and the pacemaker. If investigators ever fully explain those 41 minutes, the rest of the case may fall into place faster than people think. And until that happens, one question is still hanging over everything. Was the 41-minute gap the abduction itself, or was it the moment the original plan started to go wrong? If you have been following this case closely, tell me what you think after looking at the timeline this way. And if you want more deep breakdowns like this as new details emerge, stay with me here